It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Mark G. received the call that would forever change his life. His daughter, Mercedes Moore, had not answered her phone. And that was not like her. Mercedes was always in touch, always posting, always connected. So when her silence lingered for days, a knot tightened in his chest. Mark knew something was wrong. He arrived at her apartment in Richmond, Texas, his heart racing with fear and uncertainty. Standing outside her door, he knocked, shouted her name. No answer. Nothing. He wasn't one to hesitate, not in moments like this. His instinct screamed. Something was very wrong. Without a second thought, he kicked the door open. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The door gave way with a splintering crack. He stepped into the living room, and the world stopped. There, at the foot of the stairs, was his daughter, Mercedes. But she wasn't the bright, lively young woman he knew. She lay there motionless, lifeless. Mark's voice trembles as he recalls the horror of that moment. The sight of his daughter sprawled on the cold floor, her body a cruel contrast to the vibrant life she once led. A father never expects to find his child like this, his own flesh and blood, taken in the blink of an eye. But that's not all. The apartment was a scene of chaos. Bloodstains marred the floor. Everywhere he looked, there was evidence of a brutal struggle. It didn't make sense. Mercedes, the woman who had millions of followers online, the woman adored by her fans, this was the woman he found dead in front of him. And the walls spoke a terrifying language of their own. Strange, disturbing messages, written hastily, smeared in lipstick, left a chilling trace of the man who had been there before him. The presence of a man's body, lifeless, sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Who was he? And why was he there? The answers were nowhere in sight. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just a tragedy. This was something far darker. The reality of what had happened to Mercedes Moore was just beginning to unfold, and it would leave the world shaken. Mercedes Moore wasn't just another name in the crowd. She wasn't just an influencer or a model. She was a phenomenon. Her rise to fame didn't follow the typical path. It was a story of ambition, risk, and an unwavering drive to turn a dream into a reality. Born Janet G., Mercedes' journey started far from the glitz and glamour of social media stardom. A college dropout, Mercedes found herself in Las Vegas, seeking a new life, a fresh start. But what started as a job at a local strip club soon turned into a transformation, a reinvention of herself into something far more significant. Her name, Mercedes Moore, wasn't just about luxury. It was about the unrelenting pursuit of success. She quickly transitioned from dancing to becoming an Instagram sensation, building a following that would soon reach millions. With every post, every picture, she crafted a persona that resonated with thousands, no, millions, who were drawn to her beauty, her confidence, and her authenticity. She was no longer just a dancer, she was a star. But her fame wasn't built overnight. It was cultivated through hard work, sharp instincts, and an understanding of the power she wielded. She rubbed shoulders with the likes of Drake, Travis Scott, and Offset. In her world, the parties were high-profile, the events were exclusive, and her Instagram was flooded with glitzy images and endless admiration. She wasn't just following trends, she was setting them. As her popularity soared, so did her entrepreneurial spirit. Mercedes wasn't content with just being a pretty face on the internet. She was determined to take her career further, launching an OnlyFans account where she could connect with her growing base in a more personal way, all while earning a living many could only dream of. Through interviews with friends and family, we hear how Mercedes was more than just a digital personality. She was loved, deeply loved, by those closest to her. Her caring nature, the way she made time for those around her, was what set her apart. Yet, even in her close circles, there was envy. The price of fame is always steep, and as Mercedes' star rose, so did the eyes that watched her every move. From a dancer to an influencer, Mercedes' transition was bold, and it would eventually bring her not only fame, but also the attention of someone who would become her nightmare. At first, Kevin Alexander Accordo seemed like just another face in the crowd. Quiet, unassuming. No one would have looked twice at him, but that was part of the danger. He blended in. No criminal record, no history of violence, just a regular man with a seemingly normal life. But beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. Kevin's story doesn't begin with violence. It begins with obsession. And obsession, as we know, can grow quietly, slowly, until it consumes everything in its path. He became fixated on Mercedes more. Not in the way a fan might admire a celebrity. No, this was different. This was a relentless, consuming desire to know everything about her. It started online, as these things often do. Kevin found Mercedes on Instagram, drawn to her beauty, her confidence, and the lifestyle she projected. She was a star, a perfect, untouchable star. But for Kevin, that only fueled his fascination. He watched, he followed, and then he became a fixture in her digital world. At first, it was innocent enough, liking her posts, leaving a comment here or there. But soon, it wasn't enough. Kevin needed more. He needed to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. He meticulously tracked her social media activity. Every post, every story. Mercedes unknowingly left tiny clues behind. Her favorite coffee shop, the apartment complex she lived in, the places she went, the events she attended. He took note of it all. And that was where his obsession crossed the line. Despite having never met Mercedes in person, Kevin began to study her, gathering details like a detective, piecing together the puzzle of her life. But in his mind, the lines between fan and stalker were becoming blurred. He started planning. He wanted more than just a glimpse of her life. He wanted her. What began as admiration slowly morphed into a dangerous fixation. It's terrifying to think about. How someone can go from being seemingly harmless to a person who would take the life of someone they've never even spoken to. What could have driven Kevin from an innocent admirer to a killer? The chilling truth is that we may never know what exactly broke in him. But what we do know is this. Once Kevin decided to take control of the situation, the path to tragedy was already set in motion. Fame. It's a double-edged sword. To the outside world, it looks glamorous, luxury, adoration, and opportunities. But behind the glossy posts and flashing lights, the reality can be far darker, especially for those who live their lives in the public eye. Mercedes Moore was a star, a social media sensation with millions of followers, a woman who captivated audiences with her beauty, her confidence, and her authenticity. But that fame came with a price. As Mercedes' following grew, so did the risks. The very platform that made her famous became the tool that invited danger into her life. Fans, yes, but also the obsessed, the stalkers, the ones who crossed the line between admiration and obsession. The constant attention began to take a toll on Mercedes, emotionally and mentally. The very thing that had built her up now threatened to tear her apart. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the constant feeling that someone, somewhere, was always watching, always lurking. The pressure mounted. As a public figure, privacy became a luxury she couldn't afford. She had always shared her life with her fans, offering glimpses of her world, but the more she gave, the more they wanted. What started as harmless interactions in the comments section soon escalated into more sinister acts. Mercedes began to feel unsafe, vulnerable in her own home. Her sanctuary was no longer a place of peace. She was on edge. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face, every online comment could be the start of something dangerous. It wasn't just her fans anymore. It was the unseen threats, the anonymous accounts that flooded her inbox, leaving cryptic messages. She was being watched. One day, in a quiet moment, Mercedes confided in her family. She told them how she had started to feel paranoid, how the messages and threats were keeping her up at night. She spoke of her fears, the anxiety gnawing at her, the constant worry that someone might be getting too close. But the worst part? She was right to be scared. The more she tried to protect herself, the more real the danger became. The tension was building, silently, until it was too late. And Mercedes, just like so many before her, had nowhere to hide. In the days leading up to the tragedy, Mercedes Moore's life seemed, to everyone around her, like it was finally coming together. She had dreams, big ones, plans, the kind of plans that would set her on a path toward even more success, expanding her brand, starting a clothing line, building an empire. But it wasn't just about business for Mercedes. There was also love. For the first time in a while, she spoke about her future with someone special, her boyfriend. Marriage, children. These weren't things she'd often mentioned before, but with him, she started to see a life beyond the screen. A life that could offer her peace, safety, a future. Her father, Mark, and her family were relieved. They saw a side of Mercedes that they hadn't seen in a long time. A woman who was starting to feel settled. But even in her happiness, there was something nagging at the back of her mind. Her father, Mark, couldn't shake the worry in his heart. He'd heard her voice, heard the fear in her words, even as she brushed it off. He saw the strain in her eyes, the way she began to pull back from everything, the way she became more guarded. But she reassured him. "Everything's fine, Dad. Don't worry," she would say, with that smile that could light up any room. To the outside world, Mercedes seemed in control. She was still active on social media, still the vibrant woman who had captured millions of hearts. But behind that confidence, there was something else, an unease she couldn't hide. There were moments, quiet moments, when she spoke of her growing anxiety, the feeling that something wasn't right, that she wasn't as safe as she used to be. But these were passing comments, brushed off quickly as just part of the stress she was under. And yet, as much as she tried to push those fears aside, they remained, lurking just below the surface, whispering that the life she had worked so hard to build was more fragile than it seemed. Little did she know, the calm would not last. The storm was already on its way, and no one could have predicted how quickly it would change everything. The phone call between Mercedes and her father, Mark, would be the last conversation they ever had. It was an ordinary Sunday, or so it seemed. But when Mercedes picked up the phone, there was a quiet desperation in her voice, something her father hadn't heard before. "Dad, I don't feel safe here," she said. "I've been feeling more paranoid, and I don't want to stay here alone." Mark's heart dropped. Mercedes had always been strong, independent, but this wasn't like her. She was worried. She was afraid. He listened as she told him about the unease that had been creeping into her life. The messages, the constant eyes watching her from every corner of the internet. The pressure of fame had taken its toll, and now it seemed like her worst fears were becoming real. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Dad," she admitted. There was a sadness in her voice, a resignation that broke Mark's heart. But despite the unease, Mercedes reassured him that everything would be fine. "I'll be okay, Dad. Just come stay with me for a bit," she added, the words filled with longing. But Mark was far away on a fishing trip. He promised he'd come as soon as he could. But soon was too late. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It had been days since he last heard from her, and Mercedes, the woman who posted every day, had gone silent. The posts stopped. The messages stopped. The silence felt louder than anything. Mark's unease turned into growing concern. Was she okay? Why hadn't she answered his calls? Why hadn't she posted online? It was then that Mark decided he had to see her. He couldn't wait any longer. The thought of her alone, vulnerable, was too much to bear. He drove to her apartment, his mind racing. When he arrived, he found the door locked and no response. He knocked. He called her name. Nothing. The unease in his stomach twisted into dread. Something was wrong. With his heart pounding, he knew what he had to do. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the door down. And there, in the cold silence, he found the truth. What he saw inside that apartment would haunt him forever. The scene he walked into wasn't just a shock, it was a nightmare. The door opened, and the world fell apart. When Mark stepped inside the apartment, the world around him shattered. The once welcoming space where his daughter had lived now felt like a tomb. The door creaked open, and there, in the dim light, the truth began to unfold before him. The apartment was in disarray, a chaos that spoke volumes of the horror that had occurred within these walls. But it wasn't just the overturned furniture or scattered belongings that would haunt Mark, it was what was written on the walls. In red lipstick, smeared in haste, disturbing phrases were scrawled across the apartment. "I should have stayed in Florida. I was used." The words, disjointed and desperate, painted a picture of madness, of a mind consumed by obsession. The handwriting was erratic, like a person who had lost all control, a mind spiraling into darkness. Each phrase felt like a clues to a twisted narrative that Mark couldn't quite piece together. Who wrote these words? And why? As investigators pieced together the details, an unsettling fact emerged. There was no sign of forced entry. The door hadn't been broken down. There was no sign of struggle at the entrance. So how did Kevin, the man who would take Mercedes's life, gain access to her apartment? It wasn't just the lack of broken locks or shattered glass. It was the unsettling realization that Mercedes had allowed him in. She had trusted him. In the hours before the tragedy, this man, this stranger, had somehow gained her trust, whether through deceit or manipulation. Inside the apartment, the scene was chilling. Mercedes's body was found in a position that indicated a violent struggle. She had been strangled, and there were signs of blunt force trauma to her head, a brutal assault that left her lifeless on the floor. The violent nature of the crime spoke to the rage and hatred that had consumed her killer. But the twist? Kevin, the man responsible for this horror, wasn't some hardened criminal. He was an ordinary man with no prior criminal record. Just a man who had become obsessed, an obsession that drove him to commit the unthinkable. And in the end, it wasn't a stranger who had committed this crime. It was a man who, in the quiet corners of his mind, had decided he owned her. And no one could have predicted just how far his delusions would take him. As the investigation unfolded, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Police scoured Mercedes Moore's life, her online presence, trying to understand how Kevin had managed to infiltrate her world without ever meeting her face to face. He was a shadow in the digital landscape, watching from afar, never stepping into the light, but always lurking in the corners of her life. It became clear, Kevin had been obsessed with Mercedes for months. He followed her every move on social media, studying her posts, her likes, her interactions. Every detail, no matter how small, became part of his obsession. The clues were there all along, hidden in plain sight. Yet Mercedes had no idea that the man she had unknowingly captivated would become her greatest threat. The public's reaction to Mercedes' death was swift, but it was far from unified. On one hand, there was an outpouring of love and support for her family, a deep sense of grief shared by her fans and friends. They mourned the loss of a bright, beautiful soul who had brought joy to so many. But then, there was the other side, the voices that chose to blame. Some took to social media, pointing fingers, questioning her decisions, blaming her career as an influencer for putting her in harm's way. She should have known better, they said. She put herself at risk by living her life online. These voices, harsh and unrelenting, cut through the grief like a knife. The truth, however, was far more complex. The victim here wasn't just Mercedes. It was an entire culture of online fame, where admiration can turn into obsession, where being seen can lead to being preyed upon. But it didn't stop there. As the investigation deepened, false rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some claimed that Mercedes had died from something other than the brutal murder. Misleading stories of illness and even conspiracies about a violent sugar daddy. These rumors made the pain even worse for her family. They couldn't even grieve without the world deciding what had happened before the facts were even known. The investigation's true course, the real story of how a fan became a killer, was drowned out by the noise of misinformation, leaving everyone struggling to separate fact from fiction. The truth was out there, but it was being obscured by the very thing that had made Mercedes famous. The same platforms that could turn her into a star were now muddying the waters of justice. And in the end, the public would have to decide, was she a victim of fame, or was the truth even darker than anyone had imagined? The loss of Mercedes Moore shattered her family. Her father, Mark, couldn't understand how someone he had known all his life could be taken so suddenly, so violently. He had been a part of her world, but this was something that no father should ever face. The weight of the loss was unbearable, but what made it worse was the sudden spotlight on his daughter's life, now reduced to nothing more than a headline. "This wasn't the daughter I knew," Mark said, his voice breaking as he spoke about the media circus that followed the tragedy. His daughter, the woman they loved and cared for, was now part of a story that people judged without knowing the truth. She was more than an influencer. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Yet, all anyone saw was her career, her fame, her public life. They didn't see the woman behind the screen. And then there was London, Mercedes' sister. The grief in her voice was raw, her sorrow magnified by the endless speculation about Mercedes' life and death. She, too, was left to mourn in the public eye. The family found no peace, no closure, just the pain of watching their loved one reduced to a story for clicks. As the investigation continued, Mercedes' family became advocates, pushing for something more than just justice. They called for change. The very platforms that had given Mercedes her success were now failing to protect her, and they wanted to make sure no one else would suffer the same fate. Influencers and celebrities need protection, they said. There needs to be a safer space for those who live their lives online. Their voices echoed through the media, a plea for better security measures, a cry for safer digital spaces. But as the investigation unfolded, the answers were slow to come. The motive behind Kevin's obsession remained a mystery. What drove him to this? Was it truly the obsession with Mercedes, or was there something deeper, something darker, that we will never fully understand? The questions lingered, and the tragedy doesn't stop with Kevin. There are others who lurk in the shadows, unseen and unknown. The real danger lies in the hidden faces, the ones we may never know until it's too late. The vulnerability of online fame has never been clearer, and for Mercedes, it was a price too high to pay. But who's next? The answer remains elusive. The tragic death of Mercedes Moore sent ripples through the world of online influencers and the social media culture she had helped shape. Her rise to fame was swift, her influence undeniable. But with it came the dangers she could never have anticipated. Mercedes' story has become a stark reminder of the unseen cost of digital fame, a price that too many are paying in silence. Her death sparked a growing conversation, one that is still unfolding. How much of a price is too much to pay for visibility? How many others like Mercedes are out there, living under the constant weight of obsession, harassment, and fear, all while their lives unfold for an audience they may never meet face to face? As the documentary draws to a close, the focus shifts to awareness. Stalking, harassment, and the dark side of online fame are topics that need to be addressed, not just for those in the public eye, but for everyone who shares pieces of themselves on the internet. The truth is, no one should have to live in fear simply for being seen. In the final moments of this story, Mercedes' family speaks out, sharing their heartbreak. Her father, Mark, his voice still raw with grief, speaks of the woman he lost. Not the influencer, not the model, but his daughter. The daughter who cared so deeply for others. She had the biggest heart. Mark says, she gave love to everyone. She was always there for her family. She wasn't just a face on a screen. She was real. She was a person. London, Mercedes' sister, fights back tears as she remembers their shared moments. She was my best friend, and now she's gone. But the world needs to remember her for who she truly was, not just what they saw online. Their tribute to her goes beyond the tragedy, beyond the headlines. They remember her spirit, her laughter, her warmth. Mercedes was more than a victim of a crime. She was a symbol of everything that can go wrong when the digital world crosses boundaries it was never meant to cross. The message is clear. We must do better. We must advocate for safer spaces for public figures, influencers, and every person who finds themselves vulnerable in the digital age. The lesson here is simple. Safety matters. Awareness matters. And change is needed now. As the story ends, viewers are left with a choice to remember Mercedes, not just as a star, but as a woman who deserved to live her life without fear, and to make sure no one else has to endure the same fate.